Beijing just delivered the most devastating blow to Moscow since the war began, and it wasn't missiles or sanctions. It was something far worse: rejection. China has destroyed the economic lifelines that have kept Russia afloat. And Putin is watching his most important ally slip away like sand through his fingers. This isn't just a diplomatic shift. This is geopolitical betrayal on a scale that will reshape global power for decades. The alliance that was supposed to change Western dominance is collapsing from within, and the consequences are about to cascade across 3 continents. Beijing's major banks didn't just reduce their exposure to Russia, they executed a coordinated financial assassination. Bank of China, ICBC, and China Construction Bank have quietly severed 90% of their Russian tractions since October 2024, leaving Moscow's financial system gasping for air. The numbers are absolutely devastating. Chinese banks processed $118 billion in Russian transactions in 2022. By December 2024, that figure collapsed to just $11.8 billion, a 90% obliteration of financial cooperation that was supposed to be the backbone of their strategic partnership. Still there? Good, because the next revelation will show you exactly how China is secretly sabotaging Putin's war machine while pretending to be his friend. But first, do you think Xi Jinping planned this betrayal from the beginning? Drop your theory below and smash that subscribe button if you think China played Putin like a chess piece. While Putin, though he had a guaranteed customer for Russian oil, China has been systematically manipulating energy prices to drain Moscow's treasury. Chinese refineries aren't just buying Russian crude, they are extorting it at prices that barely cover extraction costs. China is paying an average of $43 per barrel for Russian Urals crude, while the global benchmark trades at $78. That's a 45% discount that's costing Russia $127 million per day in lost revenue. Beijing isn't Putin's ally. They're his loan shark. The manipulation goes deeper. Chinese buyers have been demanding 180-day payment terms instead of the standard 30 days, creating a cash flow nightmare for Russian energy companies. Gazprom and Rosneft are essentially providing free finances to their Chinese customers while burning through their own reserves to stay operational. Every barrel of cheap Russian oil that flows into Chinese refineries is another dollar that doesn't flow into Putin's war chest. And Beijing is executing this financial strangulation with the precision of a master strategist who never intended to be Russia's equal partner. And next, Beijing promised to share advanced technology with Russia, but Chinese tech companies are actually providing Moscow with downgraded systems while keeping cutting-edge innovations for themselves. This isn't cooperation, it's technological colonization disguised as friendship. Russian defense manufacturers discovered that Chinese semiconductors labeled as military-grade were actually consumer-level components with 40% failure rates in combat conditions. Equipment that was supposed to enhance Russian military capabilities is instead causing system failures that have cost Moscow an estimated $3.2 billion and destroyed all manufacturing weapon systems. The betrayal extends to artificial intelligence and satellite technology. While Putin expected access to China's most advanced systems, Beijing has been providing Russia with technology that's 3 to 5 generations behind their current capabilities. Russian forces are fighting with Chinese technology from 2018, while the Chinese military units deploy 2024 innovations. Furthermore, China has been using Russia as a testing ground for obsolete technology while studying Russian tactics, weaknesses, and strategic thinking. Every Chinese system installed in Russian military equipment is a window into Moscow's operations, and Beijing is watching Putin's military secrets while providing inferior tools that ensure Russian dependence. The technology gap is widening every month, and Russia's military-industrial complex is becoming increasingly dependent on Chinese systems that Beijing can disable remotely if the relationship deteriorates any further. Putin thought he was gaining a technological partner, but he actually handed China the keys to his entire defense infrastructure. There's more, and it's China's manipulation of the yuan-ruble exchange rate. This represents the most sophisticated economic warfare operation in modern history. Beijing isn't just trading with Russia. They are systematically devaluing Russian currency while protecting their own economic interests. Through coordinated trading by state-controlled banks, China has artificially suppressed the ruble's value against the yuan by an estimated 23% below fair market value. This manipulation forces Russia to provide more rubles for every yuan received, essentially giving China a permanent discount on a bilateral trade. The manipulation mechanism is brilliant and devastating. Chinese banks coordinate massive ruble sales during Moscow's trading hours, creating artificial downward pressure that Russian central bank reserves cannot counter. Russia burns through $400 to $600 million monthly defending the ruble against Chinese manipulation, money that flows directly into Beijing's reserves. Over 18 months of currency manipulation, China has extracted an estimated $14.7 billion in additional value from Russian trade while depleting Moscow's foreign currency reserves. Putin's central bank is essentially subsidizing Chinese profits while watching their own financial ammunition disappear. This isn't accidental market fluctuation. It's coordinated economic warfare that's bleeding Russia's financial reserves while strengthening China's position in every bilateral transaction. Beijing is winning a currency war that Moscow doesn't even realize is being fought. But it doesn't just end there. The nightmare continues. And next, we're going into infrastructure colonization, the likes you've never seen before. China's Belt and Road investments in Russia aren't developing Moscow's economy. They're creating infrastructure colonization that gives Beijing permanent control over Russian resources. Every Chinese-funded project includes terms that essentially mortgage Russia's future to Chinese interests. The Siberian gas pipelines that Putin celebrated as symbols of partnership are actually debt traps that will transfer Russian energy wealth to China for the next 30 years. Chinese financing terms requires Russia to provide energy at below market rates for 3 decades, while Chinese companies control pipeline operations and maintenance. Mining operations across Siberia funded by Chinese investment include provisions that give Beijing majority ownership after 20 years, regardless of Russian preferences. Putin thought he was attracting investment, but he was actually selling permanent resource rights to cover short-term budget deficits. The infrastructure debt burden is becoming crushing. Russia owes Chinese state enterprises $67 billion in belt and road loans, with payment terms that require energy and mineral deliveries at prices set by Chinese buyers. Moscow is essentially paying China to own Russian resources, and the repayment schedule extends through 2054. Every pipeline, mine, and processing facility built with Chinese money creates permanent Chinese influence over Russian economic decisions. Putin didn't gain a development partner, he accepted a colonial master who now controls significant portions of Russia's resource-generating capacity. Chinese military exports to Russia include deliberate vulnerabilities that Beijing can exploit to gather intelligence about Russian tactical operations and strategic planning. Every piece of Chinese equipment deployed by Russian forces is potentially a surveillance tool for Beijing's military planners. Russian electronic warfare systems supplied by China contain backdoors that allow Chinese intelligence services to monitor Russian communications and tactical frequencies. Equipment that's supposed to protect Russian military operations is actually providing China with a real-time intelligence about Putin's war planning and battlefield tactics. The scope of this intelligence gathering is staggering. Chinese manufactured components in Russian radar systems, communication equipment, and targeting systems are providing Beijing with comprehensive data about Russian military capabilities, limitations, and operational procedures. Analysis of captured equipment reveals that Chinese systems deployed by Russian forces have been transmitting operational data to servers controlled by Chinese military intelligence. Putin's forces are unknowingly providing their Chinese allies with detailed information about their own tactical weaknesses and strategic vulnerabilities. This intelligence operation gives China enormous advantages in any future conflict with Russia. Beijing understands Russian military capabilities better than Moscow understands Chinese systems, creating an intelligence asymmetry that could prove decisive if the current partnership completely collapses. China is systematically redirecting trade routes away from Russia while expanding alternative pathways that bypass Russian territory entirely. Beijing's infrastructure investments in Central Asia are creating permanent alternatives to Russian transportation networks, reducing Moscow's strategic importance as a transit hub. The Trans-Caspian Corridor development, funded primarily by Chinese investment, provides a direct pathway between China and Europe that eliminates Russian involvement in billions of dollars of annual trade flows. Construction is accelerating specifically to reduce dependence on Russian transportation infrastructure. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and other Central Asian nations are accepting Chinese financing for transportation projects that explicitly avoid Russian territory. These nations are choosing Chinese-funded independence over Russian-controlled dependence, and Beijing is providing the financial tools to make this transition possible. Over the next decade, Chinese trade route development will eliminate Russia's role in approximately $340 billion of annual Asian-Europe commerce. Moscow's transportation revenues are collapsing, while Chinese logistic companies capture the profits from routes that previously required Russian participation. As these obstacles continue to pile up, Chinese diplomats are privately assuring Western counterparts that Beijing's Russia relationship is temporary and transactional rather than strategic and permanent. This leads to even more economic chaos for Russia. Beijing is quietly signaling to international partners that China's long-term interests don't align with continued Russian partnership. Through carefully managed diplomatic channels, China has been indicating to European Union leaders that economic cooperation with Beijing doesn't require accepting Russian partnership. The diplomatic messaging is sophisticated and devastating to Russian interests. China is essentially telling the world that Putin's isolation doesn't need to include Chinese isolation, creating space for Beijing to maintain global relationships while Moscow becomes increasingly marginalized. Chinese participation in international forums now specifically avoids endorsing Russian positions on Ukraine, sanctions, or territorial disputes. Beijing maintains neutral language that protects Chinese interests while providing no diplomatic support for Russian international goals. This diplomatic abandonment accelerates Russian international isolation while preserving Chinese access to global markets, technology, and political influence. Putin is becoming a liability that China is systematically distancing itself from in every international context. As if it's not enough, China is manipulating statistics meant to hide the true state of this bilateral agreement. Chinese statistics about bilateral trade with Russia are deliberately inflated to disguise the actual collapse of economic cooperation. Beijing is providing Moscow with false hope about partnership sustainability while quietly reducing actual business relationships. Official Chinese trade figures show continued robust engagements with Russia, but detailed analysis reveals that 60% of reported transactions are financial accounting adjustments rather than actual goods and service exchanges. The real economic relationship has contracted far more severely than public statistics suggests. Chinese companies are using complex financial structures to report Russian businesses that doesn't actually exist, creating statistical illusions that serve both governments' political needs while concealing the dramatic reduction in genuine economic cooperation. The manipulation extends to energy statistics, technology transfer reports, and infrastructure investment figures. China is systematically overstating every aspect of Russian partnership, while actual business relationships deteriorate to levels that threaten Russian economic stability. This statistical deception serves Chinese interests by maintaining political cover for gradual Russian abandonment while providing Moscow with false confidence about partnership durability. Putin is making strategic decisions based on Chinese economic data that deliberately misrepresents the reality of bilateral cooperation. China's abandonment of Russia represents the most significant geopolitical realignment since the end of the Cold War, And Beijing's strategic patience is about to reshape global power structures in ways that will benefit Chinese interests for generations. The systematic dismantling of Russia's partnership allows China to position itself as a responsible global power that's willing to sacrifice problematic relationships for international stability. Beijing is trading Russian friendship for Western economic access worth trillions of dollars over the coming decades. Chinese strategic planners have calculated that a collapsed Russia provides more benefits than a powerful Russian partner. A weakened Russia becomes a resource supplier that China can dictate terms to, rather than an equal partner that might challenge Chinese regional dominance. The demographic and economic collapse of Russia creates opportunities for Chinese expansion into Siberian resources, Central Asian influence, and Arctic territories that a strong Russia would never surrender. Beijing is positioning itself to benefit from Russia's decline rather than preventing it. China's abandonment of Putin isn't just ending an alliance. It's accelerating Russia's collapse while positioning Beijing to inherit the benefits of Russia's weakness. This is strategic patience executed on a generational timescale, and Putin never saw the betrayal coming. The friendship without limits that once threatened Western dominance has become China's calculated sacrifice of Russian interests for long-term Chinese supremacy. Xi Jinping played Putin perfectly, and Moscow is about to pay the price for trusting a partner who was planning abandonment from the beginning. If China's strategic betrayal of Russia shocked you, smash like, tell us whether Putin ever had a chance against Chinese long-term planning, and hit subscribe, because the next country facing Chinese manipulation is conducting operations that will reshape the entire global economy.